talk. I'm happy to be here. So let me share my PowerPoint with everyone. Could you all see it?
Yes.
All right. So today I'm going to talk about my recent work on women managers and workplace gender inequality. So my plan is to talk for about 14 minutes and then open the floor for discussion, comments, any questions that you might have. So as you all know, the gender wage gap in the United States, in which women's earnings are approximately equal to 82% of men's earnings, is quite pervasive. It occurs across occupations. This means that for every dollar earned by a man, a woman makes 82 cents. And of course, this adds up across a lifetime of work to the point that this average gap translates into women earning $431,000 less than men over a lifetime. Now, there are different reasons and causes of the gender wage gap. Occupational segregation. Male-dominated industries tend to have higher salaries than industries and occupations made up mostly of female workers. There is bias against working mothers, differential access to education of males and females, and of course the obvious and not so obvious gender discrimination and gender stereotypes. So to give you an example of there are gender stereotypes about ability and can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So there are all sorts of gender stereotypes, but there are gender stereotypes about ability and competence. These are beliefs that men are more competent and better at most tasks, and particularly at certain tasks such as math and mechanical tasks, whereas women are better at nurturing tasks, which unfortunately entail lower pay. But these beliefs get internalized, affect women and men's self-assessments of their self-worth, which in turn determine and influence their career opportunities and choices and decisions. But today I want to focus on a different reason for the gender wage gap, which is organizational structures. Okay, so recent work has documented the role of managers and supervisors in perpetuating or ameliorating workplace gender inequality. For instance, recent work has shown that managers' access to organizational power structures may maintain gender inequality and gender discrimination in the workplace. And I can give you two specific examples here. So male managers, and as you probably know, men are overrepresented in leadership positions than women. And if so, male managers enact policies and make decisions that protect their group advantages and maintain the status quo. And the status quo is gender inequality. Another route here is through this, what is called a trickle-down effect of abusive supervision, abusive supervisors can have negative direct and indirect effects on workers. That is, managers, right, may copy the abusive behaviors of their supervisors, and in turn, workers may copy the abusive behaviors of their managers in their relationships with their co-workers. So far, I talked a little bit about male managers. So what about women bosses? Do they have a role in ameliorating workplace gender inequality? So first, I want to show you some good news, some positive overall effects of women bosses. This is from a recent analysis of a global survey of almost 22,000 firms from 91 countries. And what they found was that the presence of more women in leadership positions is associated with more positive economic outcomes for companies and shareholders. So if you look at this table that I got from Nolan et al. 2016 paper, the second row here, shows that a higher number of female executives is positively and statistically significantly associated with stronger firm performance. And the analysis was done for all firms and for profitable firms only. All right, so this is super good news, right? We need more women leaders because that's good for companies and shareholders. But what about the effect of women leaders in reducing gender inequality negatively affected women subordinates? Now, the picture is a little bit more complicated. There are two perspectives out there, female bosses as agents of change versus as cogs in the machine. According to the first perspective, women can act as agents of change. That is, the influx of women into management positions will tend to counteract the tendency of male managers to maintain the status quo and therefore reduce gender inequality. So, just as men in managerial positions may act to preserve the advantaged position of their male subordinates, so women in leadership positions can be expected to take actions to boost the advancement of their female subordinates. The second perspective is that women may become just cogs in the machine. So that as women assume managerial roles, they will exert a negligible or even a negative effect on the earnings and well-being of female employees. So I want to show you some evidence for the first perspective that women can function as agents of change. This is evidence from across studies showing that women in companies with a greater proportion of senior women or women reporting to a woman supervisor report lower discrimination, more positive workplace climate, in companies with a greater proportion of women bosses, more women are hired and promoted at all levels of the organization. Okay, so how about the second perspective, that women are cogs in the machine? According to this perspective, women, like men, endorse gender status beliefs that men are more valuable and more competent than women, and particularly that male leaders are more valuable and competent than female leaders. So women managers may endorse these beliefs under certain conditions. Okay, So under certain conditions, women leaders may engage in behaviors that sabotage other women, such as resisting affirmative action policies, distancing from women subordinates, and legitimizing gender hierarchy. So I don't know if you've heard of this term, Queen Bee. This is a term used to describe female managers who pursue success in male-dominated organizations in which men are valued over women. And I can give you an example from a popular movie of a female boss who engages or displays queen bee behaviors. And this is Miranda Priestley in The Devil Wears Prada. Here's a picture of her. Miranda Priestley, I know, how many of you have seen this movie? Lots of you. Okay, so thank you. Just wanted to check that you know, you can still see my presentation, and to get a sense of how many of you have seen this movie. This is a great movie. Miranda Priestley in this movie is the New York City-based editor-in-chief of this fictitious fashion magazine called The Runaway. And she displays queen bee behaviors towards her female subordinates. She treats her female subordinates very poorly, and she does everything to advance her own career at the expense of others, including other women. So I wanted to note that I'm not calling her a queen bee. And I'm trying to stay away from using that term to describe a woman leader, but rather I'm talking about queen bee behaviors that get activated under certain conditions. So I would like to talk a little bit about these conditions that motivate some women leaders to engage in these behaviors, like distancing from women subordinates, sabotaging other women, or legitimizing gender status differences. And one of these conditions is sexist organizational cultures or structures. So rather than being a source of gender inequality, according to recent work, the queen bee phenomenon is itself a consequence of the gender discrimination that women experience at work. Some workplaces have a deeply masculine culture, and employees are rewarded if they can achieve a high level of masculinity in the workplace. So these, you know, a direct effect of these deeply masculine cultures is they motivate women leaders to distance themselves from other women in the workplace, including women co-workers or subordinates, and embrace masculine characteristics such as being independent and assertive, which are characteristics that are rewarded and valued in such workplaces. So every time women leaders are confronted with the low number of women in management, or with stereotypes of women as being unsuitable leaders, or with information about gender inequities of work, their identity as a woman is threatened. And that causes them to distance themselves from other women. So, in other words, organizational cultures that communicate that women are less worthy of achieving career success than are men threaten the positive identity of women leaders. And we all know, right, and we all do it, we derive a lot of self-esteem from the groups we belong to. So if we, if our group is positive, good, valued, then we derive a lot of self-esteem and we identify with that group. But if there are messages, as there are in sexist organizational cultures, that being a woman is not valued, then some women may decide to distance themselves from other women and choose some other strategy to advance in work, such as individual mobility strategies to get ahead, as opposed to lifting all women up. And weakly identified women are particularly vulnerable to social identity threats. So these are women who feel they don't have strong ties with other women. They don't identify with other women. They don't see being a woman as being an important central part of who they are. So these women are particularly vulnerable to social identity threats and more likely to engage in queen bee behaviors than, for instance, highly identified women for whom their gender identity is very important to them and to their self-definition, who feel strong ties to other women, because highly identified women, including highly identified women leaders, are motivated to enhance the well-being of all women as a group. Okay, so I want to talk today about some of my work on female and male managers' perceptions of workplace gender inequality. So one way to preserve the status quo, that is, some people have more money than others in the workplace, is for managers to avoid concluding that gender inequality in the workplace is unfair. And one way for arrived at that conclusion, that all is good, all is fair, is to shift upwards the threshold of evidence used for deciding whether gender inequality is unfair. And I call these thresholds of evidence injustice standards, which is the amount of evidence of gender wage inequality needed to conclude that existing gender inequality is unfair to women. So by using a very high standard of evidence, social reality, whatever that is, cannot surpass that high standard. And then it's easier for managers to say that whatever gender inequity there is at work is not unfair. And therefore nothing is required of them as manager to do to restore or address that unfairness. This will make more sense when I'll show you how I measure injustice standards in the workplace. First, I want to share with you the findings of my work with non-managers. So in the context of the gender wage gap, okay, men are the advantage group because they make on average more money than women, and women are the disadvantaged group. And as advantage group members and disadvantaged group members, men and women should be motivated by different goals. That is, men are motivated to protect their advantage position, by discounting or minimizing the unfairness of gender inequality, whereas women should be motivated to challenge the status quo by perceiving gender inequality as unjust. And this is done by women setting a low standard, okay, asking for a low amount of evidence to conclude that gender inequality is unfair to women, whereas men are going to ask for a high standard, for a high amount of evidence and set a high standard to decide that gender inequality is unfair to women. So in the first study that I did on this topic, published in 2011, so 10 years ago, the participants were college students, we gave them some factual information about the extent of gender wage inequality. At that time, women earned 74.3 cents per dollar earned by equally qualified men, which translated into women earning more than $500,000 less than men over a lifetime. And then we asked them to report their injustice standards and their judgments of severity of inequality. So I want to show you an example of each. So here's how I measure injustice standards in my research and in this particular study. So participants are asked, for instance, for you to consider the existing gender wage discrepancy in the workplace unfair. The wage gap would have to be found in what percentage of populations? So we predicted that men would ask for a higher injustice standard. They'll say, well, I need to see existing gender wage discrepancy happening in 90% of occupations for me to say that this is unfair. Whereas women would say, well, it's enough for me to see it in the gender wage gap in 20% of populations for me to think that this is unfair. Okay, so again, the prediction is that men are going to set higher injustice standards compared to women. And then I want to show you two questions assessing participants' judgments of gender inequality. So how many women are currently earning less than men, and across how many occupations is the gender wage gap that disadvantages women currently occurring? So higher scores means higher perceived severity and pervasiveness of gender inequality. So here's what we found. So these are women, these are men. The blue bars are their injustice standards. The orange bars are their judgments of severity of gender inequality. And as you can see here, men set higher injustice standards. So they ask for more evidence of gender inequality in order for them to say that it is unfair to women. That is compared to women, that's a significant difference. And also men perceived gender wage inequality as being less severe and pervasive compared to women. Okay, so we wanted to see, why do men and women differ in their perceptions of the severity of gender inequality? So we did a mediation analysis when we found that the explanation, the mechanism, is injustice standards. That is, men compared to women set higher injustice standards, which predicted lower perceived severity of gender inequality. Okay. All right. So I want next. So far I talked about the role of being an advantaged group member versus a disadvantaged group member in the setting of injustice standards, which affect group members' perceptions of how bad gender inequality is, how severe. So I want to turn my attention to another factor that further corrupts people's perceptions of the unfairness or severity of gender wage inequality, and that is power. Okay, that is, power should further corrupt, for instance, managers' appraisals of workplace injustice, because power induces an egoistic, self-focused drive or goal pursuit, when the goal is to achieve whatever objectives one has at the expense of others and at the expense of justice considerations. Okay, so based on that assumption, I predicted that managers should set higher injustice standards as their managerial power increases. So as their power increases in a company, managers should ask for more evidence of workplace gender inequality in their company in order to say that that's unfair to women. Because again, by raising their standard, then whatever gender inequality exists in the workplace cannot surpass that high standard, which makes it easier for them to say things are fair, whatever gender inequality there is fair or is not that unfair, and therefore I don't need to do anything, engage in gender equality actions to address the unfair gender wage discrepancy. In the studies that I showed you so far, in the context of the gender wage gap, women are the disadvantaged group member and men are the advantaged group members. Okay. However, in the studies that I'll show you next, in which I tested female and male managers, female and male managers should both be advantaged group members, and female workers who are negatively disadvantaged by the gender wage gap in the company should be the disadvantaged group member. So because of that, I did not expect any differences between male and female managers because of their self-categorization as managers as opposed to gender categorization. So I should find the same effects of power on my selected outcomes for men and women managers. Okay. All right, so in the first study, so I tested 268 female and male managers. I measured their injustice standards. So here's an example of an injustice standard question. I had 6 in total. So how large would the discrepancy between men's salary and the salary of equally qualified female co-workers in your company have to be in order for you to conclude that the salary discrepancy is unfair to those women? Okay. So the more evidence they need, the higher their injustice standard should be. Okay. I measured power in this study as economic advantage over women co-workers. So we question like, how do you think your salary compares to salaries of women in the company business you are working for? So the higher the salary, the higher the power should be. And then we measured resistance to workplace gender equality action with one item. There is little need for further efforts to achieve economic gender equality in my workplace. Okay. All right, so let me show you what we found So these are injustice standards as a function of economic advantage. And these are the data for the men or male managers, the data for the female managers. So the blue bar is low power, orange is moderate power, and gray is high power. Okay. Again, power is operationalized as having a higher salary than women co-workers. And as you can see here, there is a linear effect. That is, as the power increases, male and female managers ask for more evidence of gender inequality in the workplace for them to say that that gender inequality is unfair to women workers. Okay, and as you can see, there is no difference between the injustice thresholds of high power male managers and of high power female managers. Okay, so we wanted to see whether we wanted to see why high power predicted a stronger resistance to workplace gender equality action. So we did a mediation analysis, and we found that, again, injustice standards is a motivational mechanism. That is, as their power increased, manager standards increased as well, and higher injustice standards predicted more resistance to workplace gender equality action. Okay, so we said, okay, that's very interesting. Let's try to replicate these results in a second study. So in a second study, we almost doubled the sample size, so almost 400 male and female managers. We used the same procedure, but we added a measure of power. So the first measure of power is the same similar to, or the same as the one used in study 1. So we asked them, how do you think your salary compares to the salaries of women in your company? So that would be power as economic advantage. But also, we operationalized power as organizational charge responsibilities, thinking that the more organizational charge responsibilities they have, the more power they have. So we measured power with questions such as, to what extent are you in charge of setting employees' salaries in your company? To what extent are you in charge of making decisions regarding the direction of the department, division you are overseeing? And then we included 3 outcome variables, measuring sort of resistance to workplace action, workplace gender equality action. So the first one was the one we used in study 1. We just added 2 items. So to measure resistance to gender equality action, we included extra items like, there is little need for making special efforts to hire and promote women in my workplace because of past gender discrimination. We included legitimizations because research on queen bee behaviors found that legitimizing gender inequality is an outcome of sexist cultures, something that women leaders do when they're threatened. We measure legitimizations with 8 items, so I can give you an example of one. Items like the existing wage gap between men and women in my workplace, if any, is justified because we are doing different jobs. Or in my workplace, women get promoted as fast as men do, and of course that is reverse scored. And then we measured attitudes toward workplace diversity policies with questions such as, the current programs for women in my workplace do more harm than good to the position of women in my company business. women will make more progress by being patient and not pushing too hard for change. Okay. So again, we predicted that regardless of the gender of the manager, as their power increased, their standards should increase as well. And higher standards should predict more resistance to workplace action. And this is what we found. So in a sense, this replicates the study 1 findings, same variables, same measure of power, that is having a higher salary than women in one's company. And as you can see again, as men's and women's, male and female managers' power increased, their injustice standards increased as well. They asked for more evidence to be convinced that gender inequality is unfair at the workplace, in the workplace. Again, notice no difference between the injustice standards set by high power men managers and women managers. So here is injustice standards as a function of organizational charge responsibilities. Remember my prediction, the more organizational charge responsibilities managers have, that means the more power they have, right? And so the more power they have, the higher their injustice thresholds should be. And indeed, we found, again, a linear effect for both men and women. That is, as their power increased, their thresholds of evidence increased as well. And again, we did mediation analysis. We are trying to, test whether higher power, the relationship between power and these outcomes is explained by the thresholds of evidence used by or set by these managers, and indeed, this is what we found, right? So as their power increased, managers asked for more evidence of gender inequality to conclude that workplace gender inequality in their company is unfair to women, and higher standards predicted higher resistance to workplace gender equality action, higher legitimization of inequality, and more negative attitudes toward workplace diversity policies. So what these two studies show is that there's really no difference between male bosses and female bosses, right, in terms of their resistance to workplace gender equality action, legitimizations, and attitudes toward workplace diversity policies. So what should we do, or what should be done to persuade women, and particularly women managers in high power positions who can do something to reduce workplace gender inequality? What can be done to convince them to engage in gender equality action? Okay. So I want to talk about 4 recommendations that I have based on my research. One is, remember when we talked, when I mentioned one of the conditions that trigger queen bee behaviors in women managers. I was telling you that sexist cultures and message in the organizational culture that women are worse than men and less valuable than men can motivate certain women, particularly weakly identify women managers, to distance themselves from their female subordinates. So then one strategy is to change the workplace climate. Because that should reduce the motivation of these weakly identified women managers to protect their positive identity by disidentifying with other women. Another implication here is to increase gender identification in female managers. And this could be done through programs and activities designed to increase gender identification through strategies that emphasize a common group identity. Okay, that is, it's us, women managers and women subordinates, one group fighting for higher salaries, against male executives responsible for women's lower salaries. And I do have some evidence from my work that shows that this strategy may work, because when women, working women, are asked to estimate the injustice standards of male co-workers, they reported more anger at the existing gender inequality in the workplace, and higher anger predicted more willingness to engage in gender equality actions. A second strategy is creating open and diverse networks as social resources for women. So at the beginning of the year, I read this very fascinating journal article by Luther, 2015, that found that female actors have a higher risk of career failure than do their male colleagues when affiliated in cohesive networks, but women, that is, female actresses, have better survival chances when embedded in open, diverse structures. And he operationalized open, diverse structures as movie teams in which there are lots of newcomers, where people don't know each other that much. When the people on the team have done movies, very diverse movies, and many different genres of movies. So they bring qualitatively different life experiences and information about contacts in the industry. Which means that people in our networks with diverse backgrounds and experiences can act as sources of information and support. So then one implication here is to develop a mentoring system to help women develop professional contacts and networks, as well as develop programs to connect women, both managers and non-managers, to open and diverse networks to increase career advancement and career opportunities. Okay, my third strategy here capitalizes on the role of perspective taking. I have done a lot of work on perspective taking and its beneficial effects, both on intergroup and interpersonal relationships. For instance, in one recent study, I found that actively adopting the perspective of women affected by gender wage inequality caused men and women to become more open to perceiving gender wage inequality as unjust and to experience higher empathic concern for women. So when men and women were asked to imagine the feelings and the situation of women negatively affected by the gender wage gap, so that's the perspective taking condition, men and women set lower injustice standards compared to control participants who are just asked to stay objective and detached about these women's situation. And they also, in the perspective taking condition, they reported higher empathic concern for these women compared to participants in the stay objective condition. No gender differences. So an implication here is to design programs and activities to teach women managers strategies to adopt an other orientation toward women subordinates, to sort of walk in their shoes. I put an asterisk here because I believe that this will not work, this strategy will not work when there are still threats to social identity present in the work environment for these women leaders. Because under those conditions, women will be motivated to self-preserve, I guess, and they will adopt whatever individual mobility strategy is available to them at the expense of other women. So first, we need to reduce or change the workplace climate, and then create programs like this that are based on perspective taking. And then the final strategy that I have capitalizes on the role of allies and all of us. There is recent work showing that men can be persuaded to challenge the status quo in solidarity with women. And this is done by creating a common identity and redefining individual instances of inequality as a collective problem. So to give you an example, in a recent study by Subasic et al., 2008, men and women read one of three messages. So, and the messages just differ in terms of who wanted more flexible work options. Fathers, mothers, or parents wanted more flexible work options to spend more time with their children. And what they found was that men were more willing to fight for flexible work options after reading the parents' framing message, because that's a condition where men and women, right, were both parents, so common group identity, and they wanted a similar goal, to achieve a similar goal, which is having flexible work options to spend more time with their children. So then an implication here is to create conditions where inequality is defined as something that concerns both men and women. And in regard to women managers, this framing should reduce the view of female leaders as self-interested, right? So should portray women as promoting, an issue that concerns both men and women. Okay, so this is my talk. Oops, sorry. So any questions you might have, let me know. Sorry, that is my phone.
Thank you so much. That was awesome.
All right.
Are there any questions from the audience? You can either put them in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, I will ask a question.
Okay.
What do you think would be the impact on your results if you considered both gender and race? Do you think that there would be bias or solidarity amongst women of different racial backgrounds?
So I'm trying to think of an example. A white female manager supervising a black female employee. I mean, I will still see the same processes happening because women managers will still categorize themselves as managers and endorse, male characteristics. On the other side of the coin, creating a common group identity should work as well, because I'm assuming the common group identity would be all of us women, right? Or we could be women working at this company. But there is some research showing that sometimes this approach, promoting a common group identity, doesn't work because disadvantaged group members still need to be recognized in terms of their identity, right? So I'm not a woman, I'm a Black woman. And that's something that I bring to the table. So I guess there could be a combination of strategies that could work, but that's an interesting question. And I didn't mention at the beginning of my talk, but the gender wage gap affects is even worse for Black women and Hispanic women. I think I have some data here that a Hispanic woman on average makes only 54 cents for every dollar made by a white man, and then a Black woman makes only 62 cents for each dollar made by a Black man. So the situation is even worse for persons of color, women of color. Hopefully, any of the strategies I suggested could be used to address the worsening and the worst gender wage gap that negatively affects women, and any, women, Black women, Hispanic women, white women, and so on.
Thank you. Lux asks in the chat, how do you think the pandemic will influence these findings?
How the pandemic will influence the attitudes of managers. Do you see a possibility of change or closing the gender wage gap? That's a good question. Because I'm thinking of the mediated communication that occurs with any mediated communication. That's why I have such a hard time, with online teaching. We miss sort of the context of the other, and that means it's a little bit difficult to adopt the perspective of the other when you don't see the other person's context, although sometimes you do see children behind women employees, and you get the right context. I think the lack of full dimensionality in interactions caused by the mediated online communications would make it even more difficult for instance, women managers or male managers to empathize with their female employees. So I guess my short answer is that it may make things worse. And of course, the pandemic has made things worse for women, because women now have added, a second or third shift, taking care of children at home. I teach my 4th grader on top of teaching my, university college students. So that made things and, exacerbated gender inequality, I think.
Yeah, it really seems like, so in women's and gender studies, we often talk about the double bind that women are in the workplace, and in particular, managers. And I think the research that you were sharing in the beginning and your research really highlights this, where the double bind is when somebody is faced with two equally problematic choices, right? And it seems like your research is supporting the fact that maybe historically, women have felt pressure to adopt a more masculine approach and sort of reject their femininity in the workplace in order to survive and advance,
Right.
which has then, had implications for upcoming women as well.
I agree. And I think that, the term queen bee behaviorist is a bit sexist and unfair, because male managers are not expected, to help their male subordinates, but we do expect female managers to help female subordinates. So there is a double standard there.
Yeah, there's a campaign called Ban Bossy. You could also insert another B word for that, but I think that's really, really connected to the research that you have conducted. Does anyone else have any other questions? I did drop an evaluation in the chat too, if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to complete that. All right, I'm not seeing any typing and I don't see any hands. So I just want to thank you so much for sharing your research with us. It is really incredible and important for us to all think about as we are in the workplace, or if you're students and working to enter the workplace, thinking about how we can advance equity for everyone.
Yeah. Thank you again for inviting me. I had a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you.